Obsession, a film most of you became obsessed with, and a project that shocked Hollywood forever. With just a budget of $750,000, it managed to gross over $400 million worldwide. But how could they achieve this? Or rather, who was the mastermind behind all of this? The person's name is Curry Barker. Barker was a creative force behind Obsession, directing, writing, editing, and even providing voice acting. He was essentially the mastermind behind the entire project. To understand what makes Obsession so successful, we first need to understand the filmmaker behind it. So, in this video, I'll be exploring Curry Barker's background, his unique style and approach to horror, and the filmography that eventually led him to Obsession. Barker's story starts in Mobile, Alabama, where he was raised by both of his parents, who worked as graphic designers and screenwriters. At just 11 years old, Barker developed an interest in horror after accidentally watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In 2017, he moved to Los Angeles to attend the New York Film Academy, where he eventually met his creative film partner and frequent collaborator, Cooper Tomlinson. The pair met during the first week of film school and immediately connected over their shared passion for filmmaking. However, they quickly realized that traditional film school wasn't necessarily the path they wanted to take. So during the first week, they dropped out and decided to pursue filmmaking on their own. They created the YouTube channel That's a Bad Idea, where they began producing comedy sketches and trailers for short films while working at Starbucks. Although their videos performed relatively well, they weren't reaching the level of recognition they had hoped for. Barker and Tomlinson realized that breaking into the traditional film industry was extremely difficult, so they continued producing sketches and comedy content independently. Eventually, the channel began to shift towards horror. Their first major horror teaser gained over 20 million views, bringing Barker and Tomlinson a new level of recognition and helping the channel surpass 1 million subscribers. With this newfound success, the pair decided to expand further into horror with Milk and Cereal. The film follows two YouTube pranksters played by Barker and Tomlinson who are attempting to create entertaining content for their audience. However, after one of their pranks goes horribly wrong, the pair become involved in a much darker situation. From there, the film descends into psychological horror as the characters begin turning against each other. What makes Milk and Cereal particularly impressive is how little Barker had to work with. The film was made on a budget of roughly €800, with most of the money going towards a camera and a single experienced actor. Because of the limited resources, filming could only take place every second weekend. The lack of staff, locations, and a large cast is noticeable throughout the film. However, Barker recognized these limitations and relies heavily on handheld camera work and minimal locations, creating a sense of realism that makes the horror feel much more personal and disturbing. Rather than feeling like a traditional Hollywood production, the film feels raw and almost documentary-like. This low-budget approach and Barker's ability to create effective horror with extremely limited resources eventually attracted the attention of Blumhouse Studios, giving him access to the resources needed for his next major project. That project would become the global phenomenon known as Obsession. Obsession follows Bear, a young man who develops an intense crush on his friend Nikki. After failing to confess his feelings, Bear makes a wish that Nikki would love him more than anyone else in the world. From there, his obsession spirals completely out of control. For Barker, the film's $750,000 budget represented a massive increase from the roughly $800 he had to work with on Milk and Cereal. But despite having significantly more resources, Barker retained many of the filmmaking techniques that made his earlier work so effective, and this is where Barker really begins to stand out as an auteur. He combines low-budget realism, comedy, and psychologically driven horror to create stories that feel authentic while still being deeply unsettling. His films often begin in relatively ordinary situations, using humor and realism to make the characters feel more relatable, before gradually pushing them into increasingly disturbing circumstances. So, with Barker's background established, let's look at what actually makes Obsession so effective, from its cinematography and acting to its sound design, symbolism, and the filmmaking techniques that separate Barker from the other modern horror directors. Before the opening scene even begins, the non-diegetic audio gradually ramps up before becoming louder and more intense before suddenly cutting to a much quieter first scene. This contrast immediately establishes the serious tone that the opening scene is going to take. In the first scene, we get a close-up of Bear as he practices confessing his feelings to a fake version of Nikki. This immediately establishes Bear's vulnerability and obsessive nature. He is framed within a grey, dull landscape, struggling to find the words to express his feelings, while his grey clothing reinforces the bleak and serious tone of the scene. During the conversation, Bear says, "I think about you all the time, Nikki, and you're in every song I listen to." These lines reveal just how deeply Bear's feelings have developed into an obsession, while also foreshadowing the direction the film will eventually take. He then says, "You were the only person who was nice to me." This gives us insight into Bear's past, suggesting that he struggled socially and that Nikki was one of the only people who genuinely supported him. This helps explain why Bear has developed such an unhealthy attachment to her. The film then foreshadows its future even further when Bear says, "And then after Nana passed, you were the only one that called, even when I didn't have anything to say, and we just sat there." This line becomes particularly significant later in the film, because instead of Nana dying, it is Bear's cat that dies. Immediately afterwards, Bear begins stalking Nikki's Instagram. The idea of having nothing to say almost becomes literal because Bear isn't actually communicating with Nikki. Instead, he is simply lying down there, watching her life through social media and becoming increasingly obsessed with her. Bear then begins questioning whether he should confess his feelings to her, saying, "I keep telling myself you'll lose her," and ironically, that is exactly what happens after he makes the wish. Finally, Bear says, "You should know that I would choose you over everything." This is arguably one of the most important lines in the opening scene because it directly foreshadows the wish Bear eventually makes, that Nikki would love him more than anyone else in the world. His willingness to put Nikki above everything else ultimately leads to the deaths of his friends and eventually himself. Throughout the confession, the diegetic audio is heavily overshadowed by the sad and emotional non-diegetic music playing in the background. This keeps our attention focused on Bear's emotional state and makes the scene feel much more serious and intimate. However, this emotional atmosphere is suddenly interrupted by Ian, who stops Bear's confession and calls it cringy. The contrast here is important. The scene goes from grey, quiet, and emotionally intense to becoming much more colourful and energetic once Ian enters. The camera also slightly looks up towards Ian while looking down at Bear, establishing the power dynamic between the two characters. Ian is visually positioned as the more dominant and confident character, while Bear appears smaller and more vulnerable. The next and final scene I'll be analysing is the flower scene. The scene begins with Bear staring towards the wall at night, with Nikki initially concealed within dark shadows. The lighting makes Nikki difficult to see, immediately creating a sense of uncertainty as she slowly emerges from the darkness. The non-diegetic audio begins to intensify, building tension for the audience. Nikki's strange behaviour continues to make the scene increasingly uncomfortable. When Bear asks, "Can you go back to bed?" the sound suddenly pauses as Nikki runs back into the darkness. This interruption of the soundtrack creates a brief moment of relief, almost making the audience believe the situation is over. However, the audio begins to build again as Nikki starts crying, creating a sense that something is still wrong. This tension is then broken by a sudden burst of silence before Nikki screams, "Why don't you love me?" The difference between silence and the sudden loud dialogue is a classic horror technique, but Barker uses the sound manipulation and sudden changes in volume to shock the audience rather than relying on conventional jump scares. Bear visibly panics as Nikki begins moving strangely around the room with the flower pot. Her unnatural movements make her appear almost disconnected from reality, creating an uncanny quality that is particularly distinctive of psychological horror. Barker makes Nikki frightening because her behavior is unpredictable and difficult for both Bear and the audience to understand. The scene also demonstrates how Barker uses the limitations of a low-budget production as part of the film's visual style. The footage of Nikki moving with the flower pot was actually a professional dancer that Barker hired. However, the dancer moved slowly during filming, and then during post-production they sped up the clip to make it unsettling and disturbing. This demonstrates how Barker adapted his filmmaking techniques to work around limited equipment and a limited budget. Well, that's all for today. Sorry if I sounded a bit sick in the later clips, because I think I recorded the start when I wasn't sick, and then I recorded it when I got sick, and then I think I recorded one today, and that one I got a lot more sick today, so I'll probably sound a bit different in each clip. I'm sorry about that, but thanks for watching.